The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a utility bill and a grocery store flyer. Its cardstock was thick, creamy, and impossibly heavy, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and arrogance. For Roxanne Bennett, that scent was a ghost, a phantom limb of a life she'd been forced to amputate 4 years ago. The embossed gold lettering wasn't just an invitation, it was a summons from her past. Gregory Lawson, her ex-husband, was requesting her presence at the 5th anniversary gala of his company, Lawson Innovative Designs. The company she had named. The company whose foundational business plan she had written on their tiny, wobbly kitchen table. It was a thinly veiled command to witness his triumph and her own perceived failure. The small, sunlit apartment on the other side of the city felt 1,000,000 miles away from the life that invitation represented. Here the air smelled of baby powder, freshly brewed coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of the crayons her children had been using that morning. 4 years had passed since Roxanne Bennett had walked out of Gregory Lawson's life, or more accurately, been pushed out with nothing but a box of personal effects and the clothes on her back. 4 years. It felt like a lifetime. She traced the sharp, unforgiving edges of the invitation with a trembling finger. In celebration of 5 years of unprecedented success, it boasted, his success, built on the scaffolding of her dreams. Roxy had met Greg in her final year of her master's program in architecture at Columbia University. She was the top of her class, a prodigy with a sketchbook full of revolutionary designs that professors lauded as the future of sustainable urban living. Greg was in the business program, charming, ambitious, with a silver tongue that could sell sand in the desert. He was captivated by her brilliance, but more than that, he was captivated by what her brilliance could do for him. He'd painted a beautiful picture for her. "We're a team, Roxy," he'd whispered, his hands tangled in her hair as they looked over the city from a borrowed rooftop. "You're the genius, the visionary. I'm the one who can make it happen. Together we'll build an empire." She believed him. She loved him so fiercely, so completely, that she didn't see the red flags. She dropped out of her program, 1 semester shy of her degree, to pour all her energy into helping him launch his firm. She worked 80-hour weeks, drafting proposals, refining blueprints, managing logistics, all while he took meetings, shook hands, and collected the credit. The name on the door was his. The face on the magazine covers was his. Her name was relegated to a footnote, then erased entirely. The first year was a whirlwind of ramen noodles and shared dreams. The second, a slow, dawning horror. As the money started rolling in, Greg changed. He became dismissive of her ideas, calling them too academic or not commercial enough, even though they were the very ideas that had secured their first major contracts. He started staying out late for client dinners, coming home smelling of strange perfume and expensive whiskey. The final argument was the ugliest. He had just landed the multi-million-dollar Kensington Tower project, a design concept lifted almost page for page from her graduate thesis. When she confronted him, her voice shaking with betrayal, he didn't even have the decency to lie. "You're being emotional, Roxy," he'd sneered, adjusting the cuffs of a new $1,000 shirt. "This is business. You were holding me back with your little pet projects. I needed a partner, not an anchor." He told her he'd met someone else, a woman named Tiffany Reed, the daughter of a real estate tycoon, someone who understood his world. He called her a gold digger, a pathetic freeloader who should be grateful for the roof he'd put over her head. He had his lawyer draw up divorce papers that painted her as an unstable, grasping woman, and he threatened to ruin her reputation in the industry if she fought for a single penny of what was rightfully hers. Heartbroken, exhausted, and pregnant with the triplets he knew nothing about, she signed the papers and walked away. The first year alone was hell. She moved into a tiny, rundown apartment, took a menial job at a local drafting firm doing grunt work, and counted every dollar. Morning sickness and despair were her constant companions. But then Leo, Finn, and Nora were born, 3 tiny, perfect beings who looked at her with absolute trust. And in their eyes, Roxanne Bennett found a reason not just to survive, but to fight. Now, holding this invitation, the old wounds ached. Why would he invite her? It was a power play, pure and simple. A spectacle. He wanted to parade his new life, his beautiful socialite wife, and his gleaming success in front of the woman he'd discarded. He wanted to see her show up in a rented dress, looking worn down by single motherhood and financial struggle, just to confirm to himself that he'd made the right choice. He wanted to shame her. "Mommy?" A small voice pulled her from the dark spiral of her thoughts. Her son, Leo, stood in the doorway of the living room, his brow furrowed with concern. At 3.5, he was already perceptive, his dark eyes a mirror of her own. Beside him, Finn was trying to put a block on his sister Nora's head. Roxy forced a smile, tucking the invitation under a stack of mail. "Hi, sweetie. Everything okay?" Leo patted over and wrapped his arms around her legs. "You look sad." She knelt, pulling him into a hug that smelled of peanut butter and childhood. "Just thinking, baby. Just thinking." She looked at her 3 children, the secret she had kept from Greg. He didn't deserve to know them. He had abdicated his right to be their father the moment he threw their mother out into the street. Her life was hard, but it was full. It was hers. She picked up the invitation again, her decision solidifying. She wasn't going. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She would throw it in the trash, where it belonged, and get back to the life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of the one he had burned down. She would not let Gregory Lawson hurt her again. Roxy tossed the invitation onto the kitchen counter with a final, dismissive flick of her wrist. The satisfying thud it made was a period at the end of a sentence she never wanted to read again. She spent the rest of the day immersed in her children, building block towers that defied gravity and reading stories about brave knights and clever princesses. By the time she tucked them into their beds, the knot of anger in her stomach had loosened. Later that evening, as she sat sketching at her drafting table, a second-hand find she'd painstakingly restored, her phone buzzed. The name on the screen made her smile, a genuine, easy smile that had been a stranger to her face for years. Dominic Beaumont. "Burning the midnight oil again, Bennett?" His voice came through the phone, a low, warm baritone that was always laced with amusement. "You know me, Dom," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "The Skyline Serenity project isn't going to design itself. I have faith in its chief architect. I just called to make sure she remembers to eat and sleep occasionally. The board is ecstatic with the preliminary models, by the way. You've outdone yourself." Praise from Dominic wasn't just flattering, it was validating. Dominic Beaumont wasn't just her boss. He was the man who had single-handedly resurrected her career. 2 years ago, struggling to make ends meet and freelancing on the side, Roxy had submitted a design to an anonymous competition for a new public library. She hadn't expected to win. She just needed the prize money. She didn't just win, she caught the attention of the competition's lead judge, Dominic Beaumont, the enigmatic CEO of Beaumont Global, one of the world's most prestigious architecture and design firms. He'd seen in her work what Greg had tried to extinguish: raw, unadulterated genius. He sought her out, listened to her story without judgment, and offered her a position that made her cry with gratitude. He gave her a team, a budget, and the creative freedom she craved. Most importantly, he gave her respect. Over the past 2 years, their professional relationship had blossomed into a deep, trusting friendship. He was a widower, having lost his wife to cancer 5 years prior, and he understood loss and reinvention. He adored Roxy's children, often stopping by with books or toys, and he was the only other person in the world who knew the full story of her marriage to Greg. "Something's on your mind," he said now, his perception as sharp as ever. "Your voice has that, 'I'm trying to pretend everything is fine' tone." Roxy sighed, her resolve to ignore the invitation wavering under the weight of his concern. "I got an invitation today." She explained what it was, her voice flat and detached as she recounted the details. Dominic was silent on the other end, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of listening. "So you're not going, obviously," she finished, trying to sound certain. "Why not?" he asked simply. The question caught her off guard. "Why not?" "Dom, it's a trap. It's a public stage for my own ritual humiliation. He wants me to show up so he and his new wife can look down their noses at me and feel superior." "And you think you're not superior to him?" Dominic's voice was gentle but firm. "Roxy, look at what you've done. You survived him. You built a life, You're raising three incredible children, and you are, without a doubt, the most talented architect I have ever had the privilege of working with. You are the head of urban design for Beaumont Global. You're leading a billion-dollar project that is going to redefine the city's skyline. Why are you letting him live in your head as if you're still that broken woman he threw away? His words were like a splash of cold, clean water. He was right. Why was she still giving Greg that power? He doesn't know any of that, she whispered. As far as he knows, I'm a struggling, single mom working a dead-end job. Then perhaps it's time he was educated, Dominic said, a hint of steel in his voice. This isn't about revenge, Roxy. Revenge is beneath you. This is about closure. It's about walking into his monument to himself and knowing that you've built something far greater on your own terms. It's about showing him, and more importantly, showing yourself, that he didn't break you. He forged you. A slow, burning idea began to form in her mind. What if she did go, not as the victim he expected, but as the woman she had become? I don't know, Dom. What would I even wear? How would I get there? A taxi? The practicalities seemed insurmountable. Silly even. Leave that to me, he said smoothly. I have a proposition for you, Bennett. Let me be your date. Roxy was stunned into silence. Your date? I have a vested interest in my star architect's well-being, he said lightly, though she could hear a deeper warmth in his tone. And frankly, I wouldn't mind seeing the look on this man's face myself. We'll make an evening of it. No pressure, no expectations. Just a night out to celebrate the magnificent woman you are. He wasn't suggesting it as a romantic gesture, but as an act of solidarity. It was an offer of strength, a shield. With Dominic Beaumont by her side, she wouldn't be Roxanne, the poor ex-wife. She would be Roxanne Bennett, a force to be reckoned with. And the kids? She asked, the last bastion of her resistance. My housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, adores them. She'd be more than happy to watch them for the evening. We'll have a car pick you up. We'll handle everything. All you have to do is say yes. She looked around her small apartment, at the sketches on her table, at the framed photo of her children laughing on her desk. This was her life, her real life. Greg's gala was just a phantom, an echo. And echoes couldn't hurt you. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. Okay, Dom, she said, her voice clear and strong. Let's go to a party. The plan was set in motion with the kind of quiet efficiency Dominic was known for. A personal stylist was dispatched to Roxy's apartment with a rack of designer gowns. Roxy, who had spent the last 4 years in practical, comfortable clothes, felt like she was playing dress-up. She finally chose a gown of deep emerald green silk that shimmered like liquid jade. It was elegant, powerful, and understated. It was everything she wanted to project. The night of the gala arrived, cloaked in the crisp air of an autumn evening. Mrs. Gable was cooing over the triplets, who were thrilled to have a new audience for their antics. As Roxy finished her makeup, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the timid, heartbroken girl Greg had cast aside. Her eyes held a new fire, her posture a quiet confidence. She was no longer a victim of her past, she was the architect of her future. A low rumble from the street below announced the arrival of her transportation. Peeking through the blinds, she gasped. It wasn't just a car, it was a black, gleaming limousine, the kind reserved for movie stars and royalty, its length taking up half the block. And as the driver opened the door, Dominic Beaumont stepped out. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, looking every bit the powerful, sophisticated billionaire he was. But it was the warm, reassuring smile he gave her as he looked up at her window that calmed the last of her fluttering nerves. This was not a return to her old life. This was the debut of her new one. The ride to the Grand Astoria Hotel was a surreal journey through a city that held so many of her ghosts. The limousine glided through the streets, its plush interior silencing the clamor of the outside world. Dominic sat beside her, a comforting and solid presence. He didn't fill the silence with platitudes. He simply poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to her. Nervous? He asked gently. Terrified, she admitted with a shaky laugh. I feel like I'm about to walk into the lion's den armed with a party dress. That's no ordinary dress, Roxy, he said, his eyes appraising her with sincere admiration. "That's armor, and you're no ordinary woman. You're a queen returning to a kingdom she never realized she'd already conquered. Remember who you are. The rest is just noise." His words settled deep within her, a calming balm on her frayed nerves. He was right. This night wasn't for Greg. It was for her. As they pulled up to the hotel's magnificent entrance, a river of luxury cars was already disgorging guests in glittering attire. Valets in crisp uniforms scurried about, and the flash of paparazzi cameras there to capture the city's elite strobed against the night. Their limousine, however, commanded a different kind of attention. It was longer, sleeker, and more imposing than the others. When the chauffeur, a stoic man named Charles, opened the door for Dominic, a murmur went through the waiting crowd. Dominic Beaumont was famously private. His appearance at any event was noteworthy. He turned and extended a hand to Roxy. As she emerged from the car, the emerald silk of her dress catching the light, the murmurs intensified. She wasn't a familiar socialite or celebrity. She was a mystery, an elegant, beautiful woman on the arm of one of the most powerful men in the city. She kept her head held high, her eyes focused forward as Dominic placed a steadying hand on the small of her back and guided her up the red-carpeted steps. They entered the ballroom, a cavernous space dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with champagne. The air was thick with the buzz of 100 conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft strains of a live jazz quartet. And there, in the center of it all, was Gregory Lawson. He was holding court, a smug, self-satisfied smile plastered on his face. He was heavier than she remembered, his features softened by indulgence. But he wore his success like a bespoke suit. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was his wife Tiffany. She was exactly as Roxy had imagined, flawlessly beautiful in a diamond-encrusted scarlet dress, her expression a carefully curated mix of glamour and boredom. They hadn't seen her yet. Roxy and Dominic paused just inside the entryway, taking a moment to observe the scene. She could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere as people began to notice them. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd. "Who is that with Dominic Beaumont? I've never seen her before. Look at that dress." Then someone who remembered Roxy from the early days of Greg's company gasped, and the whisper changed. A former colleague, a man named Robert, pointed discreetly. Greg and Tiffany followed his gaze. The effect was instantaneous and deeply satisfying. Greg's smile faltered, his glass of champagne freezing halfway to his lips. His eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in confusion. This was not what he had expected. He had envisioned Roxy shuffling in alone, looking frumpy and out of place. He had prepared a whole repertoire of pitying looks and condescending remarks. But the woman standing before him was a vision of grace and power, on the arm of a man whose net worth dwarfed his own 100 times over. Tiffany's reaction was even more transparent. Her perfectly sculpted smile tightened into a thin, hard line. Her eyes, cold and sharp, raked over Roxy from head to toe, a silent, venomous critique of her dress, her hair, her very existence. The flicker of pure, unadulterated jealousy in her gaze was as bright as the diamonds around her neck. Greg recovered quickly, his shock morphing into a mask of arrogant amusement. He disentangled himself from his wife and began to walk toward them, his stride meant to convey power and ownership of the space. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Roxanne, I have to say I'm surprised you came. I wasn't sure you'd be able to get a babysitter on such short notice." The jab was as predictable as it was pathetic. Old Roxy would have flinched. New Roxy simply offered a cool, serene smile. "Hello, Gregory," she said, her voice even and calm. "It's a lovely party. You always did know how to spend money." Before he could respond, Dominic stepped forward slightly, extending a hand. "Dominic Beaumont, and you must be Mr. Lawson. Congratulations on your anniversary." Greg was momentarily flustered. He was forced to shake the hand of the man who had arrived with his ex-wife. The power dynamic he had worked so hard to establish had been shattered before he'd even had a chance to gloat. "Mr. Beaumont," Greg said, his tone a forced mixture of deference and bravado. "This is a surprise. I wasn't aware that you and Roxanne were acquainted." Roxy is one of my most valued colleagues, Dominic said smoothly, his hand returning to the small of her back in a gesture that was both supportive and possessive. I wouldn't miss a chance to support her as she visits with old friends. The word colleagues hung in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Greg's brow furrowed. He had assumed she was working some menial job, not that she was a colleague of a titan like Beaumont. Tiffany glided up to them, her smile as fake as the roses in the centerpiece. "Roxy, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with saccharine condescension. "That's a lovely dress. It must have cost a fortune. It's so wonderful you're getting out. Gregory told me how much you've been struggling." Roxy met her gaze without blinking. "I'm doing just fine, Tiffany, but thank you for your concern." The first skirmish was over. Roxy hadn't just survived, she had won. The whispers around them were now filled with speculation and intrigue. Gregory Lawson's poor, pathetic ex-wife had just arrived in a limousine with a billionaire who called her his valued colleague. This was not the narrative Greg had intended to write, but the night was young, and Roxy knew Greg's ego was a monstrous, wounded thing. He wouldn't let this go. He would look for another way to tear her down, to reassert his dominance. She steeled herself. The grand entrance was over. The real battle was about to begin. The party swirled around them, a kaleidoscope of forced smiles and calculating glances. Greg, ever the consummate host, was forced to retreat, plastering his grin back on as he greeted newly arriving guests. But Roxy could feel his eyes on her all evening, burning with a mixture of fury and disbelief. He and Tiffany would whisper to each other behind champagne flutes, their glares like daggers aimed at her back. Dominic was a masterful shield. He never left her side, guiding her through the room, introducing her to influential people not as Greg's ex, but as Roxanne Bennett, our brilliant head of urban design. With every introduction, Roxy felt herself standing taller. She discussed zoning laws with a city councilman, debated the merits of brutalist architecture with a famed critic, and sketched out a concept for a new park on a cocktail napkin for a real estate developer. She was in her element. She was no longer a ghost in Greg's world. She was a luminary in her own. About an hour into the gala, the music softened, and Greg strode to a small stage at the front of the ballroom. A spotlight found him as he tapped a microphone. The moment Roxy had been dreading and preparing for had arrived. "Friends, partners, welcome," he began, his voice booming with manufactured warmth. "5 years ago, I had a vision to create a firm that wasn't just about buildings, but about legacies. Lawson Innovative Designs was born from nothing but ambition and hard work." Roxy felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. Nothing? He was erasing her from history right before her eyes. "Many people have helped me along the way," he continued, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing, with deliberate weight on her. "And some people can only be a part of the journey for a little while. They lack the fortitude, the vision, to see it through." The insult was clear, a direct shot aimed at her heart. The people around her who knew their history shifted uncomfortably. "Success requires making tough choices," Greg went on, puffing out his chest. "It means cutting loose anchors that hold you back and aligning yourself with partners who can help you soar." He gestured grandly to his wife. "My beautiful wife, Tiffany, whose family, the Reeds, have been instrumental in our growth." He then launched into a self-congratulatory speech about his triumphs, listing project after project, each one a twist of the knife for Roxy, as she recognized the ghost of her own design elements in each description. He was a fraud, and he was using this stage to reinforce his lies. He concluded his speech with one final, venomous flourish. "So I want to toast to the future, and to the importance of knowing your place. Some people are destined to build empires, and others are better suited to a quieter, more modest life. Let's all be grateful for finding where we belong." He raised his glass, his eyes locking on Roxy, a smug, triumphant smirk on his lips. The public humiliation was complete. He had painted her as a weak, failed woman who couldn't keep up, a modest little person he had wisely discarded. The room was quiet for a beat. People looked at Roxy with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Dominic squeezed her hand gently under the table. "Breathe," he murmured. "It's your move." As the polite applause began, Roxy stood up. A hush fell over the room. Walking with a calm, deliberate grace, she approached the stage. Greg's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of alarm. This was not part of his script. "If I may," Roxy said, her voice clear and steady, taking the secondary microphone from the stand. She didn't look at Greg. She addressed the crowd. "Gregory is right," she began, and she could see the relief wash over his face. "Success is about vision, and 5 years ago, Lawson Innovative Designs was founded on a very specific vision." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. It was a vision of sustainable, community-centric urban development, a vision of green rooftops, integrated public spaces, and energy-efficient materials. A vision detailed in a 200-page business plan and a portfolio of architectural concepts that I wrote myself. A collective gasp went through the audience. Greg's face went from pale to crimson. "Roxanne, this is hardly the time or the place." She turned to him, her eyes as cold and hard as steel. "Don't you think it's the perfect time and place, Gregory? You're celebrating the legacy of this company. I think it's important for everyone to know its true foundation." She turned back to the audience. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Roxanne Bennett. And before it was Lawson Innovative Designs, it was the Lawson Bennett Project. I was the co-founder. I was the head designer. The Kensington Tower, your flagship project? That was my master's thesis at Columbia." The room erupted in frantic whispers. Tiffany looked as if she'd been slapped. "You speak of anchors, Gregory," Roxy continued, her voice ringing with power. "The only anchor I see is a man so insecure he has to steal a woman's work and then try to publicly shame her to feel powerful. You didn't cut me loose. You committed intellectual theft and threw away the best partner you ever had because your ego couldn't handle sharing the spotlight." She set the microphone down. The silence in the room was absolute, thick with shock and dawning realization. Greg stood on the stage, speechless, his face a mask of pure rage. Just then, Dominic stood up from their table and walked to her side, placing a proud, protective arm around her. "For anyone wondering what true vision and talent look like," Dominic announced to the stunned crowd, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who owned rooms like this. "Roxanne Bennett is currently the head of urban design at my firm, Beaumont Global. She is the lead architect of the Skyline Serenity Project, the largest and most innovative redevelopment project this city has seen in 50 years. She isn't living a modest life. She is building the future, and I am honored to not only call her my colleague, but my partner." He used the word partner with deliberate ambiguity, letting the crowd interpret it as they wished. The message was clear. Roxy wasn't just surviving. She was thriving at a level Greg could only dream of. She hadn't just landed on her feet. She was soaring in the stratosphere. Greg's carefully constructed empire of lies had just been leveled by a nuclear bomb of truth. His face, contorted with fury and humiliation, was a spectacle of defeat. He had invited his ex-wife to shame her, and instead, she had exposed him as a fraud and unveiled herself as a titan, all in front of his most important clients and colleagues. The night was a catastrophe for him, and it wasn't even over yet. The ballroom was a powder keg of scandal. Guests were no longer mingling. They were huddled in small buzzing groups, casting glances between the humiliated Gregory Lawson on stage and the poised, powerful Roxanne Bennett, who now stood beside Dominic Beaumont as if she were surveying a kingdom. She had not only defended herself, she had systematically dismantled Greg's entire public persona. Greg, stumbling off the stage, was intercepted by his wife. "Do something, Gregory!" Tiffany hissed, her voice a low, furious viper's hiss. Her perfectly made-up face was a mask of cold fury. The humiliation was hers now, too. "They're laughing at us." Blinded by rage and a desperate need to reclaim control, Greg did the worst possible thing. He marched directly toward Roxy and Dominic, his fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he seethed, his voice dangerously low. "Coming here, putting on this little show with your new sugar daddy. You always were a pathetic gold digger." Dominic took a half step in front of Roxy, a silent warning, but Roxy put a hand on his arm, stopping him. This was her fight. "The only thing I've ever taken from you, Greg, is my name," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion but a weary contempt. Everything else you seem to have taken from me. Oh, please, he scoffed, his eyes wild. He gestured dismissively at Dominic. So you found a rich old man to take care of you. I'm sure he's thrilled. What's next? You gonna pop out a few kids for him to secure your new meal ticket? The insult was vile, crude, and profoundly stupid, but in his desperate flailing, he had unwittingly handed her the final, devastating weapon. The air around Roxy went still. A strange, almost pitying calm settled over her. She looked at this man, this loud, posturing, hollow man, and felt nothing but the vast, empty space where her love for him used to be. She held his gaze. Her voice when she spoke was not loud, but it cut through the din of the room like a shard of ice. I don't need to have children for a meal ticket, Greg, she said quietly. I already have 3. Greg let out a harsh, barking laugh. Right. I'm sure you do. Let me guess. You found some poor sap to knock you up right after you left me? He was trying to paint her as promiscuous, as damaged goods. This was it, the final truth, the one she had held back not out of fear, but out of a desire to protect her children from the toxic mess that was their biological father. But he had pushed, and now he was about to fall into the chasm he had dug for himself. She looked him directly in the eye. No, Greg, she said, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. Yet every person nearby heard it as if she had screamed. I got pregnant right before you threw me out. The world seemed to stop. Greg's sneer froze on his face. Tiffany's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up to her hairline. Even Dominic, who knew the whole story, looked at Roxy with renewed awe at her steely composure. Greg's mind was clearly struggling to process the information, the timeline. A flicker of confusion, then dawning horror, crossed his features. What are you talking about? He stammered. I'm talking about my children, Greg, she said, her voice as steady as a rock. My 3.5-year-old triplets, Leo, Finn, and Nora. She let the names hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, catastrophic blow. They're yours, Greg. If her previous revelation had been a bomb, this was the apocalypse. The silence that followed was so profound, it was like the air had been sucked from the room. Tiffany made a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Greg stared at her, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man who had been shot. No, he whispered, shaking his head in frantic denial. No, you're lying. You're a vindictive, lying... Am I? Roxy interrupted, her calm unwavering. Do the math, Greg. Think back to that weekend in the Catskills, 2 weeks before you told me you were leaving me for Tiffany. I tried to tell you I wasn't feeling well. You told me to stop being so dramatic. The specific memory, a detail only they would know, struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his denial crumbling. He looked at Roxy, truly looked at her, and perhaps for the first time, he saw the truth. The timeline matched. The possibility, the horrifying, life-altering possibility, was real. Tiffany, however, recovered from her shock with venomous speed. She turned on Greg, her eyes blazing with a fury that was terrifying to behold. Triplets, she shrieked, all pretense of decorum gone. You had children with this nobody, and you never told me? I didn't know, Greg pleaded, turning to her, his desperation palpable. Tiffany, honey, she's lying. She's trying to ruin us. But the seed of doubt was planted. Tiffany looked from Greg's panicked, sweaty face to Roxy's serene, resolute one. She looked at Dominic Beaumont, standing by Roxy's side like a king guarding his queen. She saw the whispers, the stares, the pitying looks from her social circle. Her husband was not the powerful empire builder he claimed to be. He was a liar, a thief, and now potentially the absentee father of 3 children with the woman he had publicly tried to destroy. My father will hear about this, Tiffany spat at Greg, her words like poison darts. Our lawyers will be in touch. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the ballroom, her scarlet dress a slash of fury against the stunned crowd. Greg was left standing alone in the middle of the room, exposed and utterly destroyed. He had invited his poor ex-wife to shame her. She had arrived with a billionaire, a limousine, and a truth that had just detonated his entire life. He looked at Roxy one last time, his eyes filled with a terrifying cocktail of hatred, disbelief, and a sliver of dawning, gut-wrenching regret. Roxy simply turned, took Dominic's offered arm, and walked away, leaving Gregory Lawson to choke on the ashes of his own success. The moment they were back inside the quiet sanctuary of the limousine, the armor Roxy had worn all night finally began to crack. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips, and she sagged against the plush leather seats. All the adrenaline, the fear, and the righteous anger that had fueled her drained away, leaving a profound and hollow exhaustion in its wake. Dominic didn't speak. He simply reached over, took her hand, and held it firmly in his own. His thumb drew slow, comforting circles on her knuckles. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of profound solidarity. They rode in silence for several blocks, the city lights a blur of color through the tinted windows. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, his voice low and gentle. "I think so," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I feel empty. For 4 years, that whole story has been this huge weight inside me. Saying it out loud, it's like I let it go." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Dom. I couldn't have done that without you." "You did all of it yourself, Roxy," he said, his gaze warm and sincere. "I was just a witness to your strength." He deserved every single word of it. "He'll fight me," she said, the practicalities of the situation beginning to dawn. "About the children. He's a narcissist. First he'll deny it, then he'll try to use them as a weapon against me." "Then we will fight back," Dominic said with quiet, unshakable certainty. "You are not alone in this anymore. I've already had my legal team on standby since you told me about the invitation. We will be prepared for anything he tries." The sheer relief that washed over Roxy was immense. For the first time in years, she didn't have to face the battle alone. Meanwhile, back at the Grand Astoria, Gregory Lawson's world was imploding in spectacular fashion. The gala had ended abruptly, the guests fleeing the toxic atmosphere like rats from a sinking ship. The whispers had turned into a torrent of gossip that would be all over the city's society pages by morning. Greg stood alone in the empty ballroom, the half-eaten canapes and abandoned champagne glasses a testament to his ruin. His phone buzzed incessantly. First, a text from Tiffany. "Don't bother coming home. My things will be gone by morning, so will yours." Next, a call from his father-in-law, the formidable tycoon William Reed. Greg answered with a trembling hand. "Lawson," Reed's voice boomed, cold as a tombstone. "You have 5 minutes to explain the catastrophe I'm hearing about from a dozen different sources." Greg stammered through a pathetic, disjointed explanation, painting Roxy as a vengeful liar. Reed was silent for a moment. "So, let me get this straight," the older man finally said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You publicly humiliated the mother of your 3 potential children, who happens to be the star architect for Dominic Beaumont, and you're claiming she's the one who's unstable? Do you have any idea how this looks? Beaumont Global is our biggest competitor on the new waterfront deal. You've not only made a fool of yourself, you've made a fool of my daughter and my family. You've handed our rival a PR victory on a silver platter." "Sir, I can fix this," Greg began. "You'll fix nothing," Reed snapped. "The Reed Capital investment in your firm is under review. Our board meeting is Monday morning. I suggest you get a lawyer. In fact, get several." The line went dead. Greg's blood ran cold. Reed Capital was more than just an investor. They were his primary financial backer, holding a controlling interest in his company. Without their support, he was finished. The next few days were a blur of escalating disasters. As Dominic had predicted, Greg's first move was to publicly deny paternity, releasing a statement through a crisis PR firm that called Roxy's claims slanderous and desperate. Dominic's legal team responded immediately, filing a petition to establish paternity, which included a request for a court-ordered DNA test. It was a move Greg couldn't refuse without looking guilty. He was trapped. The test was arranged, a sterile and silent affair in a downtown clinic. Roxy watched as Greg refused to even look at the 3 beautiful children playing in the waiting area, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He saw them not as human beings, but as problems, as evidence of his colossal failure. 2 weeks later, the results came in. Paternity, 99.99% probability. It was undeniable. The confirmation was the final nail in Greg's coffin. Tiffany, who had perhaps held on to a sliver of hope that it was all a lie, immediately filed for divorce, her lawyers moving with brutal efficiency to protect her assets and sever all ties. William Reed followed through on his threat, pulling all of Reed Capital's funding from Lawson Innovative Designs. The announcement caused a panic among his other investors. Clients began to pull out of contracts, spooked by the scandal and the firm's sudden financial instability. The empire Greg had bragged about was crumbling into dust. His employees, many of whom had secretly respected Roxy and resented Greg's arrogance, began to jump ship, some even reaching out to Beaumont Global for positions. His company, built on a foundation of stolen ideas and propped up by his father-in-law's money, had no real substance. Without those two pillars, it simply collapsed. Greg was forced to sell his penthouse apartment to cover his mounting legal fees. He moved into a sterile, soulless rental. The phone calls stopped. The invitations dried up. He was a pariah, a joke in the circles he had tried so desperately to conquer. He was alone, truly and completely alone, haunted by the specter of the family he never knew he had, and the woman whose genius he had so foolishly underestimated. He had tried to extinguish her light, and instead he had only succeeded in burning his own world to the ground. 6 months later, spring had arrived, painting the city in vibrant shades of green and gold. For Roxy, it felt like the world was finally reflecting the profound and beautiful changes in her own life. The legal battles with Greg had concluded, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Faced with irrefutable DNA evidence and his own financial ruin, Greg had acquiesced to all of Roxy's terms. He was ordered to pay a substantial amount in backdated and ongoing child support, a legal obligation he could now barely afford, and was granted supervised visitation rights twice a month. He had shown up for the first 2 visits, his interactions with the children awkward and strained. He didn't know how to talk to them, how to play with them. He looked at them with a strange mix of resentment and confusion, as if they were living symbols of his downfall. After the second visit, he stopped coming. He sent a brief email to Roxy's lawyer stating he was relinquishing his visitation rights for the foreseeable future to focus on rebuilding his life. Roxy felt a pang of sadness, not for Greg, but for Leo, Finn, and Nora. They deserved a father who wanted them, but she also felt a quiet relief. Her children would be spared his toxicity. They had a far better male role model in their lives now. Her relationship with Dominic had evolved slowly, naturally, from friendship into something deeper. After the gala, the lines between professional and personal had blurred. He had been her rock through the legal proceedings, had celebrated her victories, and had sat with her on quiet evenings after the kids were asleep, just talking. They had discovered a shared passion not just for architecture, but for life, for creating things that last. One evening, as they were looking over the blueprints for the now famous Skyline Serenity project, he had simply reached for her hand, and everything had clicked into place. Their love wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a carefully constructed foundation, built on respect, trust, and genuine affection. He loved her children as if they were his own, and they adored him, calling him Dom and clamoring for him to read their bedtime stories. Today was a significant day. Roxy stood on a platform overlooking a vast construction site, a hard hat on her head. The groundbreaking ceremony for the Skyline Serenity project was underway. Mayor, senators, and the city's most influential figures were in attendance. In the front row sat Dominic with Leo, Finn, and Nora, all wearing tiny matching hard hats, sitting on his lap and on either side of him. When it was her turn to speak, Roxy walked to the podium, not with nervousness, but with a deep, abiding sense of peace. She looked out at the crowd, at the powerful people, at the press, but her eyes found Dominic and her children, her true north. Buildings are more than just steel and glass, she began, her voice carrying over the sound of the city. They are the homes for our memories, the frameworks for our communities, and the blueprints for our future. They should be built not on ego or greed, but on integrity, vision, and a deep respect for the people who will inhabit them. Her words were a quiet rebuke of everything Greg and his hollow company had stood for. The Skyline Serenity Project is designed to be a space for everyone, she continued, a place of community, sustainability, and beauty, a place to build a life. After the ceremony, as champagne was being served, Roxy was approached by Robert, her former colleague from Lawson Innovative Designs, the one who had first pointed her out to Greg at the gala. He now worked for a competitor. "Roxy," he said, looking humbled, "I just wanted to say congratulations. What you're doing here? It's incredible. We all knew back then. We knew the best ideas were yours." He paused, then added quietly, "As for Greg, I saw him last week. He's working as a junior consultant for a small firm out in the suburbs. He sold the company for pennies on the dollar to liquidate. He looks like a ghost." Roxy nodded, accepting the information without malice or triumph. Greg's fate was no longer her concern. He was a closed chapter, a discarded draft of a life she was no longer living. She walked over to Dominic, who was now patiently explaining how a crane worked to a very curious fin. She scooped Nora into her arms and kissed her rosy cheek. Leo tugged on her hand. "Mommy, can we get ice cream after?" he asked. "We can get all the ice cream in the world," she said, laughing. Dominic wrapped a free arm around her waist, pulling her and Nora close. "I'm so proud of you, Roxanne Bennett," he murmured in her ear, his voice filled with love. She leaned her head against his shoulder, looking at the city skyline she was about to reshape. She had her health, her brilliant children, a career that fulfilled her, and the love of a good, honorable man. She had everything that mattered. Gregory Lawson had invited her to his party to witness his success and her failure. But in the end, the only thing he had succeeded in doing was showing her and the world what true success really looked like. It wasn't about lavish parties or stolen glory. It was about building a life from the ground up on a foundation of truth, resilience, and love. And her foundation was unshakable. So what can we take away from Roxy's incredible journey? It's a powerful reminder that our past does not have to define our future. She was betrayed and discarded, left with nothing but her own talent and an impossible secret. But instead of letting bitterness consume her, she channeled her pain into purpose. She focused on her children and her craft, rebuilding her life brick by brick, blueprint by blueprint. Her story teaches us that true strength isn't about seeking revenge. It's about rising so high that those who tried to bury you can only look up in awe. It shows that integrity is the most valuable asset, and that a life built on lies will inevitably crumble. Roxy's ultimate triumph wasn't just exposing her ex-husband. It was in the quiet, profound joy of the life she built for herself. What do you think was Greg's biggest mistake? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of resilience and poetic justice inspired you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will move and motivate you. Thank you for listening.